Autumn in Maplebridge was the kind of quiet that wrapped around your bones. Crisp leaves danced along the sidewalks. The air carried the soft smell of cinnamon from the nearby bakery, and golden light filtered through trees like something from an old memory. Nora Hayes lived in a second-floor apartment above her flower shop, Petal and Pine, where the mornings always began with the clinking of teacups and the scent of fresh eucalyptus. Nora wasn't the kind of woman who sought out chaos. She preferred soft things, poetry, quiet coffee shops, well-worn sweaters. After losing her father 3 years ago and walking away from a failed engagement shortly after, her heart had learned to beat slower, more cautiously. She had built a life rooted in routine, and though it sometimes felt lonely, it was safe. Everything shifted the morning she met Caleb. He walked into her shop on a Thursday just after the rain. The doorbell jingled, and she looked up from trimming a bundle of white ranunculus. He was tall, with coffee-dark eyes and damp hair that curled slightly at the edges. A duffel bag hung from his shoulder, and he held a crumpled piece of paper in one hand. He looked out of place, and yet, somehow, as if he'd always belonged there. "Sorry," he said, brushing rain from his jacket. "I'm looking for a place called Petal and Pine. My aunt owns it, or used to, I guess." Nora blinked. "I own it now. Your aunt was Miriam." He nodded. "Yeah, I'm Caleb Whitaker. She was my godmother. I just found out about everything. The will, the shop, the town, all of it." Nora's heart softened. Miriam had been a staple in the town, a generous soul who taught Nora everything she knew about floristry before retiring to the coast. Her passing, only 2 weeks ago, still felt like a hollow echo through the halls of the shop. "I'm so sorry," she said gently. Miriam was ... nodded. Caleb nodded, swallowing hard. "She left me the property, but I didn't come to sell it. I thought maybe I could figure out why she loved this place so much." And in that moment, Nora realized something. Caleb wasn't here to uproot anything. He was searching for roots of his own. Their conversation was short, but something lingered in the air when he left, a feeling she couldn't quite name. He hadn't just walked into her shop that day. He had walked into something far more sacred. Her carefully guarded world. Maplebridge wasn't the kind of town you stumbled into. It was the kind of place you arrived at when you needed to remember how to breathe. With cobblestone paths, ivy-covered cafes, and a local bookstore that still hand-wrote their recommendations on bookmarks, it lived at the pace of kindness. Nora had made her peace with slow. After years in Chicago building a life with someone who never fully saw her, coming back home was an act of courage. The breakup had shattered more than her heart. It had made her doubt whether she was hard to love. But Petal and Pine gave her something her old life never did: space to bloom. Her days were simple, but full. Opening the shop at 7 a.m., blending flower teas for walk-in customers, arranging bouquets for birthdays, apologies, or just becauses. She wrote letters to herself in the margins of old journals and pressed wildflowers between pages of books she'd already read. Her friends teased her for being a walking Pinterest board, but she liked her quiet ways. Caleb was not quiet by nature, but lately life had demanded stillness from him. He was a traveling documentary filmmaker. His work had taken him from dusty villages in Morocco to the icy edge of Iceland. He had lived for adrenaline, stories, and the next flight. But then came burnout. And then came the news of Miriam's passing, a woman who had once taken him in for 2 summers after his parents divorced. He hadn't seen her in 10 years, and yet her will had named him sole heir to the shop and the small apartment above it. It confused him, touched him, and made him question the rhythm of the life he had been chasing. Now, Caleb found himself walking Maplebridge's quiet streets in the early hours. sipping herbal tea instead of coffee and listening to his own thoughts something he had avoided for years. He hadn't expected Nora Dodd at first. He thought she was simply kind, efficient, sweet in that small town way where everyone said good morning and meant it. But something about her lingered in his thoughts after every interaction. She wasn't just nice, she was present. When she looked at you, it was as if she was really listening. She laughed with her whole face. She arranged flowers like she was, painting emotions into them. She talked softly but meant every word. And when she walked away, Caleb felt the echo of her presence like a song that stuck in your head. Over the next few days, they saw each other more, always casually, always in passing. He helped her lift crates of marigolds. She offered him a mug of rose honey tea during a cold morning. He brought her leftover coffee from the cafe down the street. She gave him a tour of the shop's attic, filled with Miriam's things. And somehow, in the rhythm of that ordinary town, they were becoming part of each other's routines. What Nora didn't know was that Caleb had been quietly filming his stay in Maple Bridge, capturing the beauty of the town. The fading sunlight through antique windows, the sound of the wind weaving through flower stems. What Caleb didn't know was that Nora had started sketching again, something she hadn't done since college, and that the first face she'd drawn in years was his. In the evenings, they both sat alone, her with a candle and her sketchbook, him with a notebook and his camera, and both of them, unknowingly, were beginning to make space for someone they hadn't seen coming. Neither had said the words out loud, but the truth was growing between them. Quietly and surely, he was beginning to feel like home to her, and she felt like the reason he'd stopped running. The first time they spent more than 10 minutes together was by accident. The bookstore next to Nora's shop was hosting a poetry night, and when Caleb wandered in out of curiosity, he saw her sitting near the back, hugging a mug of lavender tea, cheeks slightly pink under the dim glow of string lights. He almost turned around, but then she looked up and smiled. Not the polite kind, not the I know you kind. It was quiet, real, like she was happy he'd walked in. So he stayed. They ended up sitting together, listening to amateur poets pour their hearts out. At one point, a man in his 60s read a poem about growing old beside someone you love, and Caleb glanced at Nora. Just as she wiped the corner of her eye, they didn't say anything about it, but when they walked out afterward, Nora murmured, "Some people speak in flowers." I think I'm finally starting to understand that. Caleb looked at her for a moment too long, and something shifted between them. The following week, they shared more space. He helped her set up a wedding floral display at the community hall. She asked him to film a short behind-the-scenes video for the shop's new website. They began to meet for morning tea, not planned, not discussed, but expected, like sunrises and warm jackets. They laughed over things that didn't need to be funny. He teased her about the 10 different types of ribbon she insisted on keeping. She teased him for taking dramatic shots of squirrels in the park. He told her about Morocco. He told her about Morocco. About riding on the edge of desert winds, she told him. About the time she accidentally sent a bouquet of sympathy, lured to a couple celebrating their anniversary. I died of embarrassment, she said, cheeks flushed. But they thought it was hilarious. They kept them. You're not used to being wrong, are you? He teased. I'm not used to being seen, she replied softly. He blinked out the way she said it, without self-pity. Just honesty hit something deep in him. She didn't say much after that. She didn't have to. He saw her, and maybe she was beginning to see him too. One evening, Nora invited Caleb to join her at the town's annual harvest festival. The main street glittered with lanterns, stalls of caramel apples, local crafts, and live folk music echoing under the open sky. Nora wore a burnt orange scarf and held her gloves in one hand as they walked side by side. Their arms brushed once, then again. Then they didn't move away. They weren't quite holding hands, but their fingers kept bumping as if testing the water. He bought her hot cider. She bought him a paper lantern. You're supposed to write a wish, she explained, handing him a marker. What did you write on yours? He asked. She hesitated, then showed him. To feel brave again. He looked at her, startled by the rawness of it. She smiled quickly. It's silly, I know. No, he said gently. It's perfect. He turned his lantern over and, without showing her, wrote a single word. Stay. Later, as they released the glowing lanterns into the night sky, their hands touched. Again longer. This time, intentional. They both felt it, but neither moved. Because this wasn't a firestorm of passion, it was a slow-burning warmth that whispered, You're safe here. A few days later, during a quiet afternoon storm, the power flickered and went out in Nora's shop. She had just lit candles when Caleb walked in, drenched from the rain, carrying an umbrella and a paper bag. I brought emergency pastries, he grinned. They sat on the floor near the front window, sharing croissants by candlelight while the wind howled outside. Rain streaked the glass. Everything else fell away. I used to think love had to be big, she said suddenly, loud, movie scene worthy. But lately, I don't know. I think maybe love feels more like this. Caleb turned to her slowly. What does it feel like? She blinked, and then, in a whisper, like quiet you want to stay in forever. And he knew in that instant that he was falling, not for the version of her people saw in passing, but for the soft, honest, wildly brave woman she tried to hide. Behind bouquets and steady smiles, he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away, and in the stillness, between raindrops and candlelight, the silence between them became something sacred. The days that followed were stitched with soft togetherness. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, but it was real. It was the way Caleb would wait until Nora locked up her shop each evening so they could walk home together, even if it meant circling the block twice before reaching her door. The way she'd brew him a new blend of floral tea every morning, trying to surprise him with flavors he hadn't guessed yet. Still think rose petals taste like perfume? Sheep teas? Less today, he'd reply with a crooked smile. Love, they discovered, was found in the details. Like when he fixed the wobbly table in her back room without being asked. Or when she noticed he always slept badly on stormy nights and left chamomile and a handwritten note outside his door. They hadn't labeled it yet, whatever this was growing between them. But it was clear to both of them that what they shared was something neither had expected, and neither wanted to rush. One evening, Nora invited Caleb to her upstairs apartment for dinner. She'd never invited anyone into her home like this, not since the end of her engagement. Back then, her life had been full of compromise, cooking meals she didn't like, listening to conversations that didn't include her voice. But tonight felt different. It felt like something sacred she wore, her hair down, tucked behind one ear. Her sweater was cream-colored and soft. She looked like comfort itself. Caleb brought over a bottle of local apple wine and a handful of wildflowers he picked from the trail behind the bookstore. She laughed when he handed them to her, cheeks flushed with warmth. I couldn't exactly walk into Petal and Pine and buy your flowers, could I? No, she said, setting them in a glass jar, but these are perfect. They ate on the balcony under string lights. Autumn had arrived in full now, and leaves rustled around them like soft applause. After dinner, they shared a throw blanket and sat close, knees touching. The town was quiet below, windows glowing in the distance. Like stars fallen to earth. She turned to him, voice barely above a whisper. Do you ever miss it? The noise, the cities, the places. He considered it, sometimes, but not the loneliness that came with it. It turns out I don't really miss the constant movement. I think I was just scared to stop because of what you'd feel if you did. He looked at her. Nora always knew the right questions. He nodded slowly. Yeah, because once it's quiet, you can't hide from what's real. She turned her face toward him then, slowly. What's real for you now? The silence stretched, but not awkwardly. It stretched like warmth, like something falling into place. You, he said, and she blinked back the sudden sting in her eyes. A week later, Caleb brought her to a hidden spot outside of town. A clearing near a small lake, framed by tall grass and golden trees. He spread out a blanket and handed her a camera. I want to show you what I see, he said, together. They took photos her first time behind the lens, his first time sharing the space behind it. He showed her how to adjust the light. She showed him how to see the beauty in overlooked things, a dew-covered branch, a crooked fence, the way the light caught in her hair. They took a photo of each other at the same time, laughing, surprised. And perfectly mirrored. He printed it for her the next day. She hung it on the fridge. That same night, back at his place, she told him about her dad. How losing him so suddenly shattered her compass. How she never found her way back to feeling safe in someone else's presence again. How the silence after his death made her distrust joy. I've always been the one left behind, she admitted. I guess I started choosing the quiet so I wouldn't have to lose anything again. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix it. He simply reached across the couch and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. I'm not going anywhere, he said quietly. And even if I did, I think a part of me would always stay in that shop with you. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but for once, they didn't feel like loss. They felt like healing. They fell asleep on that couch, tangled in a throw blanket, the soft hush of night surrounding them. Nothing more than two people holding each other. As the world spun quietly outside, it wasn't passion that burned. It was trust, and that burned brighter. Over the next few weeks, their bond grew naturally. Nora taught Caleb how to arrange bouquets properly, laughing as he fumbled with delicate stems. Caleb introduced her to his drone camera and taught her how to fly it over the river valley. He even convinced her to let him record a video series titled The Language of Flowers, featuring her explaining what each bloom meant. The video went viral in town. People called it magical, authentic. She called it terrifying. He called it beautiful. She blushed. He didn't stop smiling for hours. Then came the moment. Neither of them could deny any longer. It was a rainy night. She was restocking in the shop. When he came in without a word, soaked, holding a box in his hands. Inside were prints of every photo they'd taken together, organized, captioned, carefully labeled. I don't know what this is becoming, he said, eyes searching hers, but I want it. I want us, even if I don't have the perfect words for it yet. Nora stepped toward him, eyes wide and full. You don't need the perfect words, she whispered. And finally, under the soft hum of rain, they kissed, not out of excitement, not out of drama, but because they'd already fallen into each other 100 times before. This time, they just finally let it catch up to them for weeks. It felt like life was blooming around them. The town adored them, the flower girl, and the filmmaker, as the local baker called them. Children smiled when they passed by. Strangers watched them with soft envy. Even the wind seemed to carry their names like a song. But love is not measured by the good days. It's tested in the days that ask if it can stay when everything else tries to move on. The email came on a Tuesday morning. Caleb hadn't been expecting it. The documentary he'd shot last year in Kenya, a deeply personal story about environmental change and community resilience, had been nominated for an international award. Not just that the London Film Fellowship was offering him a year-long residency, mentorship, funding, global travel, a dream opportunity. the kind he used to live for. He stared at the screen for a long time, the cursor blinking, waiting. But this time, the thought of leaving didn't feel like freedom. It felt like something unraveling. He didn't tell Nora right away, not because he didn't trust her, but because a part of him was scared that even the mention of leaving would make her disappear. He had just found her. What if this broke what they'd built? Meanwhile, Nora noticed his silence. He started showing up later, smiling less, lost in thought. He missed 2 tea mornings in a row. He forgot to bring pastries for the Friday walk. These weren't big things, but she noticed. Because once you've learned to live in silence, you can tell when someone starts filling the room with distance instead of words. One night, as they sat in her living room, music low and a puzzle half finished between them, she finally asked, "Caleb, is something changing?" He looked up sharply, heart stuttering. I didn't want to say anything yet, because I didn't want it to matter." "What didn't you want to matter?" He took a breath. "I got offered a fellowship in London, 1 year. Full travel and production funding. It's everything I've worked toward for the last decade." Her eyes didn't flinch. Her voice didn't waver, but her heart, it cracked quietly, like ice beneath the surface. "And you didn't tell me because I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to hurt us. You thought not telling me wouldn't." The silence that followed wasn't angry. It was worse. It was disappointed. The next day, Nora walked alone to the lake where they had once taken photographs together. She sat under the tree and tried to make sense of the ache in her chest. This wasn't about London. It wasn't about opportunities. It was about the feeling that no matter how deeply someone seemed to care, she always ended up being the place they left, not the one they chose to stay in. Caleb, meanwhile, sat in his apartment staring at his packed bag and an open notebook. He had scribbled Nora's name 3 times and crossed it out. He thought of her laugh, of her sketchbook. Of how she always gave him the center flower in her bouquet arrangements, the one with the softest shade. How could he explain that this time the dream didn't feel complete without her? But also, how could he ask her to wait again? To trust that he wouldn't vanish like the rest? They didn't speak for 3 days, and in a town as small as Maplebridge, 3 days felt like years. Nora went through the motions at the flower shop, smiling for customers, pressing roses, making tea for strangers. But she didn't brew a second cup anymore. Caleb walked through town like a ghost, hands in pockets, camera untouched in his SATCHEL. The night before his flight, he returned to the bookstore where he'd first watched her cry at a poem about growing old with someone. He stood in that same spot. And whispered, "I think I already did." But just as he turned to leave, he saw something in the corner window, one of Nora's hand-drawn flyers for the shop. At the bottom, written in her delicate script, were words that made him stop cold. "You don't have to be loud to be loved. You just have to stay." His throat tightened. His hands shook. And suddenly, London didn't look like a dream anymore. It looked like a goodbye. He wasn't willing to say the train to the airport was scheduled to leave at 7:30 m. At 6:52, Caleb stood outside Petal and Pine, staring up at the second-floor window where Nora's light was still off. The sky was streaked with pale morning blue, the town not yet awake. He could still catch his flight. His bag was packed. The ticket folded neatly in his back pocket, but his heart, it wasn't going anywhere. He took the steps 2 at a time, hands cold, breath trembling. And when he knocked on her door, he didn't know if she'd answer. That she did, hair messy from sleep, sweatshirt hanging off one shoulder, eyes red from the night before. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to, because he did. "I'm not going," he whispered. Nora blinked. "I got to the station," he said, breath hitching. "But all I could think about was how nothing in the world has ever made me feel more at home than standing in this hallway hoping you'd open the door." "Caleb, I know this opportunity is everything I've worked for. But what good is the world if I have to give you up to chase it? Tears welled in her eyes. You don't have to give up your dreams for me, she said, voice trembling. I'm not, he replied. I'm redefining them. You once told me love feels like quiet you want to stay in forever. That's what this is for me, Nora. You're the quiet I'd never want to leave. She stepped forward slowly. Do you mean that? He nodded fiercely. I filmed the sunsets of 5 continents. Nora, but nothing compares to the way your face lights up when you talk about hydrangeas. I've heard the wind in the Icelandic cliffs and the songs of the Sahara dunes, but none of it moved me the way your silence does. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, his official acceptance letter. Then he tore it in half and let the pieces fall to the floor. I choose you. Over and over, I choose you. She broke, but not from sadness, from the weight of finally being enough, from the relief of not being left behind, from the love she tried so hard to keep small, now blooming in full color. She stepped into his arms, her tears wetting his collar. I was so afraid, she whispered into his chest. Afraid you'd see all of me and still leave? He pulled back just enough to lift her chin. I saw you, he said, and I stayed. And then softly, like a promise sealed with every breath left in him, I love you, Nora. She smiled, tearfully, joyfully. I love you too, Caleb. They kissed again, there in the hallway of that quiet apartment, the morning light spilling over them like a blessing. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't uncertain. It was the kiss of people who had walked through fear and come out holding each other's hands, It was the kind of kiss that whispered, this is where we begin again, It began slowly, the way everything meaningful often does. There were no fireworks the morning after Caleb chose to stay. Just sunlight creeping through Nora's kitchen windows, the scent of cinnamon bread rising from the oven, and 2 mugs of tea steeping side by side. But it was perfect. He moved into the small apartment above Petal and Pine, turning Miriam's old study into a creative nook filled with cameras, storyboards, and Nora's sketches framed on the wall. She never called herself an artist, but he insisted. You draw the things I feel but can't explain, he told her, and she had smiled, as if finally beginning to believe it might be true. The town welcomed them as if they'd always been a pair. At the Fall Harvest Fair, they hosted a booth together, Caleb photographing families under a flower arch, while Nora handed out hand-tied bouquets. In the evenings, they walked hand in hand through maple-lined streets, the kind of quiet contentment between them that made strangers turn and smile. Their love wasn't a grand display, it was in the way he'd warm her mug before pouring tea, and how she'd add little drawings to the labels of his film canisters, in the way they sat beside each other without needing to speak, because everything they once feared was now simply known. Months passed like turning pages in a book they never wanted to end. One snowy afternoon, Caleb knelt in the flower shop with a ring tied to the stem of a winter rose. He didn't say anything. Elaborate, just, I want to be the quiet you grow old with. And Nora, eyes shining, whispered, yes. The wedding was small, under the willow tree near the lake where they'd taken photos together. Nora wore a soft blue dress. Caleb wore the biggest smile Maplebridge had ever seen. Friends brought homemade desserts. The bookstore owner read a poem Nora had once cried to, and when they said their vows, the wind blew gently, as if the world itself was listening. A year later, Petal and Pine expanded into the shop next door. Together, they opened a tiny gallery. Space in the back, showcasing Caleb's stills and Nora's pressed flower art. Locals called it a place where love lives on the walls. They never stopped walking to work together, never stopped making each other tea, in the moments that might have once felt too quiet. They found everything they ever needed, because he had walked into her life like he belonged there. And now he always would.